Hello and welcome to Novara FM. My name is Eleanor Penny. In the 5 years since the last general election, we've seen a historic reversal in the fortunes of the ruling party. The Conservatives had a huge majority and a leader who was reliably popular with their base, energised by the prospect of a hard Brexit, hard borders, and the promise of a prosperous new decade to come. It didn't quite work out like that. When the snap general election was called just a few weeks ago, it seemed a lot like the rain-drenched Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was organising his own political wake. Labour was, and continues to be, riding high in the polls, and the Tories are floundering as they struggle to govern their party, let alone the country. Meanwhile, Starmer's Labour Party tries to walk the line between promising stability and continuity in the face of chaos and promising some nebulous kind of change. The furthest right flanks of the Conservatives are breaking away, merging with street movements, and the left have a meagre handful of candidates with a chance at power. So, how did we get here? What do we make of the demise of the Conservative Party, and what might Starmerism actually deliver in office? I sat down with James Butler to discuss the trudge to number 10. James is a writer, a contributing editor at the London Review of Books, and a co-founder of Novara Media. We talked about Nigel Farage, fiscal conservatism, the climate crisis, and what remains for the British left. So we have with us in the studio James Butler. Hello, James. Welcome.
Hello.
Welcome back. So listeners over the past couple of years might be familiar with our illustrious Novara co-founder making a return to the airwaves for the Christmas episode. But this is maybe a less festive occasion. And I can't believe I'm saying that about the impending downfall of the Tories. So, James, we're going into the election, not long to go now. How are you feeling?
I've been writing a piece every week for the LRB during the campaign, and I was surprised to find myself calling it this week both boring and frustrating. We find ourselves in this kind of strange, intermezzo, in the sense that, we're waiting for the next government to be formed. And then all the crises which are waiting in the wings to arrive and turn up and make life terrible for us, but even more terrible for the government will start to manifest. And so, one finds oneself sort of waiting, which is never a great feeling. And I think, you mentioned how strange it is to be sat here observing the destruction of the Conservative Party, and it's really coming apart at the seams, and to feel nothing.
Talking of feeling nothing, I want to entrance and delight you with a little excerpt from an interview with Keir Starmer that you may have seen doing the rounds on social media. Bear with me, listeners, because it's a bit of a long extract. And this is in The Guardian, right? They are trying their best to resuscitate this man's image, to make him seem like he has something to say. Here is how that goes. What about a quick-fire round, I say to Keir Starmer, who is pushed for time on the campaign trail? A few snapshots to help glimpse the man likely to be PM? Starmer's nodding. He's keen to be helpful, keen to be a sport, although a little unsure of this magazine profile business and the need to talk about feelings. We are in the green room, all mirrors and concrete, the backstage at Labour Party's Scottish launch in Inverclyde, and unless I'm mistaken, he still has on a layer of foundation. Ready? He folds his arms across his chest. Yes, by all means, we should have done this as back and forth, but there we go. But then he can't really say if he's strictly an optimist or a pessimist. And no, doesn't know if he's an extrovert or an introvert either. I've never really thought about it. I don't know what that tells you. He doesn't know what he dreamed last night or ever. I don't dream. Just hits the pillow at 11 and then, and this is in quotes, bang, is out till around 5. He doesn't have a favourite novel or poem, wasn't scared of anything as a child. Quote, nothing, no phobias. This is harder than I thought. What about his lovely heather-coloured tie? Where is it from and who chose it? He takes it between finger and thumb. Would you say heather? I had it down as slightly darker. Quickfire is perhaps not his format. The obvious answer is that he, has no soul and no longing and no blood, and is literally just a series of inside leg measurements and HMRC receipts rather. But I think there's something interesting here, right? Genuinely about his posture about being a no man in an attempt to be an everyman, and what that says about his vision of like unity and nation. What does this kind of posture tell us about his politics?
Yes, I mean, I think that there's several interesting things there. One is that a political consultant would have told you, don't say "I don't dream" as you don't. That's not. It's not something that you offer as a quote. I mean, apt though it is. The other thing that I suppose is interesting and is worth saying is that, of course, this hasn't always been the kind of answers that he's given to questions like this. So, various people have dug up previous profiles where he talks about enjoying James Kelman, for instance, as a favourite novelist. And perhaps that tells us that his sense of what it means to take an office like this is to sort of completely efface and empty out one's personality into the role. And that's not uncommon. I mean, I think people who aspire to high office often feel that it sort of replaces or takes over their personality in some way. That has been perhaps less the case with recent occupants of that office. But yes, certainly there's a desire not to, certain sort of hesitancy about revealing anything that may find, may be perceived as, deviating from the sort of center ground, making himself a sort of object with which everyone can identify. I mean, look, this is a man who, as a child, was a very, very serious musician. I don't believe for one moment that he doesn't think very seriously about music even today. And that he doesn't have tastes which would shock and horrify the Daily Mail. I mean, he may even, I think Stockhausen might be a step too far for him, but that he would look like an out of touch liberal elitist. But what's important here is that this is a syndrome, this sort of, highly sort of effaced personality is a syndrome which, it's part of the same structure that allows, so-called maverick politicians like Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage to trade on their personality because it contrasts so strongly. And you've seen it a lot during this campaign, I think, where like it's not just the leaders, it's almost every politician who will just repeat. I mean, it's not a completely new thing. It used to happen quite a lot. The sort of, you're asked a question and you just kind of keep repeating your key message, like a sort of speak your weight machine programmed by Labour HQ. But it's really started, it's striking to me in this campaign how little actual response to press questioning is being given by either leader. And that's bad for democracy. I watch a politician do that and I say, okay, well, you don't have an answer to this. You are fraudulent. You are treating me with contempt. And what I want to see is someone who's willing to engage with the question, someone who's willing to give an answer to the question. And this is the territory from which, people like Farage profit. That's a very obvious point to make in one sense. But, in a sense, I also find it indicative of one of the things I've said about this campaign is that it indicates a kind of exhaustion in the structure of British politics. And I think that is true. I mean, I think on various fronts we're reaching a kind of crunch point, both in terms of the sort of structure of politics in this country, but also the manner in which politics is conducted. I mean, ultimately, we're really sort of circling the plug in terms of the plug hole in terms of control over narrative in that sense. It feels to me like there's some sort of crunch coming.
I think that sort of sense of exhaustion is really key here because there is this complete dissociative madness that comes along with engaging in any substantive way with the answers, as you're saying, that Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer or any of the sort of centre-ish parties are giving, because there is this absolute lockdown unity on its attempt to be popular without being seen as populist. Because obviously there is this contradiction in terms, because everyone wants to say we're divided, right? But particularly someone like Keir Starmer doesn't want to go so far as naming those divisions, because as soon as you start naming those divisions, you start making political claims, particularly political claims about what is good and bad. But against this backdrop, there are genuinely sort of populist offers, right? And I'm not necessarily, puffing up the prospects of, what the British and especially English electorate are likely to go for here. But, stuff like not having literal shit in the rivers, that's something, right? But the problem is there is this lockdown around no one wants to spend any money. And as you were writing in your columns, so much of this election is attended by wanting to scream, okay, how? With what? For even the most meager, tooth-gnashingly racist offer from the Conservative Party, everything costs money. No one wants to spend it.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing the Conservatives are willing to spend money on is sort of shoveling countless millions to Paul Kagame in Rwanda, who must be delighted. I mean, he's not going to have to take any refugees, but he will take the money. This is the key problem in some sense in this campaign, is that everyone knows that there's an enormous black hole in the budgets for kind of social spending over the course of the next year. No party is willing to say anything meaningful about it, and that means that you can't take anything that they say seriously. I mean, to be honest, there are various people who have complained about the manifestos not being taken seriously. Look, we've got really serious promises in here, but they're just not. Until you talk about that, until you talk about this, huge black hole, in terms of service delivery, which it sounds abstract, but this is people's lives. We're talking about we're talking about everything from roads to education to whatever. So this is it's really substantive and important. So that's what I mean in one sense is that sense of kind of just waiting is that that you're being lied to. They know that they're lying to you. You know that they know that they're lying to you. And so you're just going to have to wait for them to, turn up on July the 5th and then actually tell you what they're going to do, which might not be very much. And the other thing here I think that's interesting is you mentioned that there's that there's certainly a series of kind of potential issues or offers that could be parlayed into a sort of populist, bracketing any anxiety either of us may have about the term populist, which is imprecise and fuzzy and whatever. There could be the material from which such a campaign is constructed. It is striking that so little is being done about that. You will see from time to time, people say, "Oh, well, if we could just get these together, and then we could have a real sort of strong left-wing party." I'm not completely convinced by that argument. There are strong reasons to believe that things are going to be very difficult for a Labour government, however large its majority, and perhaps we can talk about some of those reasons, perhaps. And it doesn't seem clear to me that it's prepared for that. I mean, it seems striking to me that it might well be the only people who are not voting Labour in this election are people who are members of the Labour Party, who are mostly feeling pretty dissatisfied with the direction that the party is going. But look, one of the things that's so frustrating about this is that it's very hard to talk about what's going to happen next, in terms of what the parties have been saying. I will say, one of the things that is frustrating to me is the way that, so you will have seen that there are various journalists who have suggested that that many of their colleagues are going softly on the Labour Party or sort of holding on to gossip and details or things that might unsettle them, because they have a sense that Labour's going to be in power, they want to be in with the new regime and whatever. And this is what this means is that there's been very, very minimal scrutiny ahead of time on this stuff. And it does feel to me that as well as the political system being exhausted, there are just journalists who are not doing their jobs.
So we've taken a sort of slightly bleak account or deeply bleak account about what it's like to live through this particular moment in history. So let's go back a little bit now. You've talked about Keir Starmer having been sort of lucky in his opponents, and I think I couldn't agree more, really, in many, many senses. But there is the question, right, of when did the current massive structural deep cracks in the Tory party begin to emerge? And was that before the last election? Are we seeing a kind of a longer history here, or is that that's tied to structural factors, or is this a sort of contextual mismanagement of the party by who happens to be in charge of it?
Yeah, look, this is a really interesting question. It's a salutary one. I mean, one thing to remember is that parties can die. I mean, they do. It would be unusual, it would seem weird for us, for the Conservative Party to completely collapse and not regenerate itself, because one of the things that they've been very good at over the course of their existence is simply sort of, changing. They're much like the British Constitution in that sense, and they change kind of almost entirely while also looking the same on the outside. The very famous Lampedusa line about everything must change so everything can remain the same is important here, or telling here. My sense is that the difficulties with the Conservatives started in 2019 in one sense, which is that their electoral coalition started to look very, very weird, in that the interests of the people who voted for them and the interests of the people who were representing them in Parliament diverged quite strongly. So, key, one of the questions here is whether you take the things that were being said about so-called levelling up in 2019 seriously, or whether you think they were, largely fraudulent attempts to garner votes and then, do whatever. And that's quite an undecidable question. There are people in the Conservative Party who so I'm thinking, Boris Johnson, when he's passing through that phase of his brain, probably would say levelling up is a good idea, wouldn't actually do anything about it, is incapable of making it happen, is mostly sort of self-interest or whatever. But he can see that it's a future of some kind. Someone like Michael Gove, who's a much more interesting and sinister operator, can see that, look, the crossover point right now, 2024, for support for the Conservative Party, in terms of age, is about 70 years old. So everyone under 70, you're getting more people supporting Labour than you are the Conservative Party. That is not a sustainable picture for the Conservative Party. About 1.5 million people who voted for the Conservative Party in the last election are now dead. These are serious and existential problems for the party. But what's interesting about the 2019 coalition is that it's very, very contradictory. It's very, that you have, the core Tory vote, probably the people who will still vote Tory in this election, plus a bunch of sort of, the so-called Red Wall, the various people who are voting sort of, who've swung one way or another from who've been alienated by Labour and who are voting Conservative in the last election, who are voting and who are partly voting simply to give a kick to the system. That's one of the reasons that people were voting in the way that they did, because Johnson is Johnson. Now there are longer term backgrounds to that, right? And, the fact that kind of classic Conservative support is fragmenting anyway. Conservatism hasn't kept up with the way in which the people who might vote for it, their lives have changed. But the reason it's interesting to look at someone like Michael Gove is that Gove talks about, okay, well, we really do need a housing offer. We really do need to, there are people who are naturally kind of centre-right voters. And I'm not saying the Conservative Party is centre-right. I think it's sort of an ideological mishmash, to be honest. There are some centre-right politicians in it. There are some far-right politicians in it. It's kind of all over the place, really, at the moment. He recognises the problem, but they can't do anything about it, and they're unwilling to do anything about it. And one of the reasons they're unwilling to do anything about it is that the interests that make up the party, partly the donor class, partly the political part of the party, and partly the voter base as of 2019, are just pulling in different directions. Now, that's a management problem for the Conservative Party, but you can see that there may be a similar problem coming down the line for the Labour Party, partly because it's going to win such a huge majority in this election, and that's going to unite some people who have very, very profoundly different interests and desires for the party. So it's going to have to make a decision at some point. The other thing I would say here, and it's something that can make one sound like a sort of deranged former Hillary Clinton obsessive, is that there is a problem with the sort of media environment in this country. And it's on two fronts. One is that political obsessives, especially on the right, are watching things like GB News, which, in between, the occasional thing that it, is, fairly punchy and unobjectionable, just has like really profoundly mad stuff on it. The Neil Oliver guy, who's a sort of conspiracy theorist. Add that to the sort of strange post-broadcast media environment that now constitutes, to be honest, most people's sort of political intake. Increasingly hard to track. Obviously we can talk about sort of, various, your boomer uncle being driven mental by Facebook. That's a thing that happens. But, you've also got, what on earth is being circulated on WhatsApp, what's being circulated on those much sort of more direct peer-to-peer contact networks where it's much harder to trace for people outside of the immediate distributional relation. This is something that has affected the Conservative Party. And you see it in people like Mark Francois, you see it in people who really has gone quite or Andrew Bridgen, who has gone really, really strange.
Can you tell us about what you mean by that sort of strangeness?
The World Economic Forum and the IMF are going to put chips in your brain or that sort of thing. The sort of, the all-purpose sort of, globalist conspiracy theory, which is something that incidentally Nigel Farage has been mentioning in this election. I don't know if you saw a couple of days ago, said, I will take Britain out of the World Economic Forum. I will cancel our membership. Well, of course, Britain is not a member because WEF doesn't have, anyway, whatever. Yeah. But the point is not the detail. That's the mistake, right? Is to check him on the detail, to say like, well, actually, you're wrong about the detail here. Yeah. That was a quite Keir Starmerish voice.
Just got a chill running down my spine, but carry on.
Eleanor, can I be very clear? There is something. Look, we know that kind of fact checking is not the great defense against this stuff. What does actually work is less than clear, and I think one has to be honest about that. But yeah, so all that's to say that there's a kind of media environment here which is kind of pulling things in strange directions, and look, or you may not know. Like, you hang around like people involved in Westminster politics. They're still all glued to Twitter. And that has a serious effect. People discount Twitter because like, it's not very big, in terms of kind of global reach, it's not a huge platform. But like everyone in the media, everyone in politics is still glued to their Twitter feed. And it has a really profound effect on the sort of things that they think of as significant. And some of the ideological problems in the Tory party, you can see it taking this shape. And the other thing here is that they just haven't done anything, right? Over the, and one of the things that's, I was trying to draw up a list of the legislation that Rishi Sunak has been responsible for over the course of his tenure. And it's really, it's really, really small and inconsequential. So, I found myself thinking, well, trying to list the achievements. He imposed harder sentences on people who steal dogs or cats from people. Great. Ooh. You'd imagine the country didn't have serious problems. And that, the other thing here is you run a country that's running into the dirt for 14 years. You just reap the consequences. And I think it is as simple as that in some ways. I think, they've just lost the mandate of heaven, as it were.
I think that point about the conspiracy theory addled sort of media, and I think I can go so far as to say sort of social terrain in which this election is operating, is very interesting in terms of the prospects for any politician to be able to break through with a kind of earnest, forthright economic offer for the honest working man, woman, other, etc. Because if you look at things like ULEZ, right, it's like, call me the swivel-eyed one, but I think it's uncomplicatedly a good thing to have like fewer kids dying of asthma because they are, inhaling toxic fumes, right? It's become near untouchable for any kind of politician to mention it, right? If they want an easy ride in the press, because there are, very powerful elements who will sort of just hear the idea of the ultra-low emission zone and switch off their critical faculties. Sorry about that. And so maybe this is a call for, I guess, the left, right, to be a little bit more circumspect in how we would want a politician who represents, and this is a very broad, baggy, vague term, us, to operate within these grounds, right? Because it's just, to my eyes, simply not true that you could come along with, say, an offer that we would otherwise support and expect that to get cut through. So, what is a Keir Starmer, even crossing our fingers that he's lying to us and he secretly has progressive policies smuggled in a wooden leg into number 10 somewhere? Like, how would we even expect him to maneuver within that situation?
Yeah, that's right. And I think the first thing is to say, although it is a cherished fantasy of lots of sort of, liberal commentators, I don't find it plausible that there's a sort of secret
Right.
left-wing manifesto that he's got secreted in his heart and he's going to put into action when he's in place. I do think there will be pressures on them because they will have so substantial a majority to act in ways that they might plausibly get away with not doing, if they looked in greater peril while they're in power. Mm-hmm. And just that, there are certain details on that. So there's the question of public sector pay awards, which are coming very soon after they come into power. There's which can provoke quite serious strikes. There's the question of the junior doctors, which they will need to resolve fairly promptly. Universities may go. There are a whole clutch of universities which may just go bankrupt at the beginning of the next year. There are various, almost every school is, every state school is probably going into the next year with their budgets right at the margins, if not in the red already. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of these crises on which they'll feel compelled to act, and there'll be pressure for them to act because they have a sort of substantive majority. So it may well be that you see kind of greater action on various things, from the Treasury. But it's a question of degrees, and they're fairly small degrees. The difficulty, I think, here is also about what their vision of the world is. So the one thing is, like, it would be great. And I have to say, even Blair did this when he was campaigning in 97. He would be, it was rare, but he would occasionally say to people, I just think you're wrong about that, actually. I think you're wrong, and here's why. Mm-hmm. And that's something that politicians just don't do anymore. And it's politicians of the right and left. I'm sure if you cast your mind back to the 2019 election, you will remember Richard Burgon, who was, in various ways one of the representatives of the so-called left of the Labour Party, going on to Question Time and being harangued by a man who was earning $80,000 a year, and said, that doesn't put me in the top 5% of earners or whatever. And the thing to say there is, look, yes, it does actually. It does. There's an objective fact here, and you don't realise how much you're earning, but you are earning it anyway. Whatever. Right.
And you say, like, it's if we accept the fact that this man believes himself to be struggling on 80K, and there are huge swaths of people earning. I just don't think that that's actually a hard point to make.
So there's a point where being sort of combative is to me, it seems a rather good idea. But look, I mean, the other problem here is that it's been difficult to really figure out what Starmer's vision of the world is. And one of the things that you mentioned, the recent Guardian profile earlier, and one of the things that's interesting about it is that he says, I just keep going on, I keep on and keep on. And so he's not, he presents himself at least as a man who's not enormously reflective about the world around him. Again, for various reasons, I think that's probably only a partial picture. But I think he probably likes to think of himself as that way and thinks of himself as not susceptible to the kind of airy-fairy reflection on the world or kind of grand theory that other people are prone to, which he, I think, probably sees as rather a weakness, or probably sees as rather debilitating. But what that means is that he finds himself in a situation where he's effectively trying to do Wilsonism 2.0, right? So he wants to do what Harold Wilson tried to do and failed, which is enact a kind of corporatism. So the state functions as a kind of mediator between capital and labour, right? So it's the state that will, either curb the kind of excessive demands of labour, although it would be nice if organised labour made an excessive demand from time to time. That would be great. Sharon Graham, if you're listening. Or any demand at all. That's not quite fair, but, and to curb sort of private rapacity as well. That's the theory, right? And a strong state can do that. Now, there were reasons that didn't work under Wilsonism. There was a very brief period in which it looked plausible, and then the sort of global economic structure got to a place partly to do with various shocks to the supply chain, various other things that are feeding through into prices and sort of labor costs and things like that you just wasn't possible for the state to play that role. And it's always going to be difficult for the state to play that role, but it was more plausible in an era in which the kind of capital you were mediating for or between capital and labor was sort of largely industrial capital.
Yeah.
In an era in which we are very much not characterized by our industrial base, it seems less and less plausible to me that the state is going to be in a position where it can bring finance capital to heal, or indeed sort of, look, it can impose some limits on the way that capital exploits labor in the service sector, but it's, they're fairly minimal. One of the interesting frontiers of this is something like GB Energy, where it's a slightly different thing. But again, the state is serving as a de-risking entity for finance capital. But two, doesn't seem to have as part of it, that strong a curb on the kind of rapacity that finance in particular exhibits when it's active in sort of new technologies or when it's taking over firms. The other thing here is that, of course, one of the reasons that Wilson was ultimately undone, and look, there is a reason to draw comparisons between Starmer and Wilson. One, he's occasionally cited Wilson as an inspiration, but two, he's clearly not a Blairite. He's certainly not a Corbynite. So one reaches for historical analogies, and Wilson's probably the closest. They only take us so far. I think it's always unwise to think, oh, well, there must be something in the tradition of Labourism that Starmer is doing. I think mostly the Starmer disposition is simply a new one. It doesn't have a clear heritage in the party. But if there's one, it's Wilson. And one of the things that undid Wilson was saying, I'm going to have a GDP target. I'm going to grow the economy by this much. And it didn't happen. And it's one of the things that happens when you make kind of really big, strong promises on GDP is you paint a political target on your back. And that seems to me one of the unwise things about saying, we're going to get the highest sustained growth in the G7, which gives you little wiggle room on the question of sustained, right? Like how long is sustained and, how short is sustained, or, where your comparators are. But really, the G7, that includes the United States, which has, sort of global hegemonic profits rolling into it. So that seems implausible to me. There are reasons it might happen. Lots of the G7 nations are affected by the same syndrome that's affecting Britain, which is partly a productivity problem, partly simply the results of having increasingly costly services in a developed economy, which is something that is not necessarily a problem and is not necessarily surprising, but is always going to happen. So yeah, there's a big political problem sort of coming down the line on that stuff. Just to say, the other thing I think that is important to think about Labour in power is the propensity of Labour governments to authoritarianism. And this is where actually Blair is the good example for someone like Starmer. Now, Blair had a very rich interior life. It was often quite delusional. It was often quite messianic. But Blairism in power, characterized though it was by sort of various bits of really, rather helpful sort of social reforms, and we wouldn't want to minimize it. There's a certain conformism which is kind of very, very core to the Labour Party's identity. And I think Starmer certainly shares it. You saw it in that interview. But it's the kind of thing that made it genuinely shocking to Labour figures, relatively early on in the Blair administration, where people were revealed to be having affairs or affairs with their secretaries. Just wasn't thought of as something that Labour people did. More pressing and more importantly than that, the Blair era was characterized by just a real happiness to beef up police powers in one way or another, to impose sort of coercive solutions or solutions of sort of disciplinary force in one way or another on, whether that was people out of work, whether it was, people you suspected of terrorism, to look at kind of civil rights as a sort of, or civil liberties as a really inconvenient obstruction to getting the thing that you wanted done. This is a very common thing that happens with Labour governments. I'm not saying that the Conservatives don't abuse human rights. It's just it's done in a rather different way. And I think it's very visible. There are traces of it already in Labour's manifesto. I think it's one to watch out for when they're in power, because there is a tendency within Labour governments. All of which is to say, if people are listening to this wondering like, oh, what am I going to, what am I going to do with my life, my political life, or my career if I work in an NGO under a Labour government? Might be good to be getting into questions of transparency, questions of accountability, questions of means of holding the government to account, because it's certainly not going to come from inside the Commons.
I want to draw together that question of Wilson-esque industrial policy and the question of social discipline and the expansion of police powers, because certainly we can think about them as coterminous insofar as how a Labour government sees itself as the intermediary between capital and the working class, necessitating having stronger mechanisms of disciplining the working class, right? And it speaks to a central question which always comes up, at least for me, when I'm seeing certainly Starmer's Labour Party, but to a lesser extent also the Conservatives, which is, what do you think is wrong, right? What is your diagnosis of the supposedly both deep cracks in society and also something that only needs a kind of a stern bureaucratic hand at the tiller, right? It seems to be sort of several contradictions there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the strange paradoxes of the way that the Labour Party talks about the society it wishes to govern is that on the one hand, it can recognise that there are serious problems, right? It can see, and it's helpful here that it's been in opposition for 14 years, because it can say, oh, well, it's caused by 14 years of destruction. It can see that there are huge problems. At the same time, it tends to suggest, or tends to talk about Britain as if it were a company whose fundamentals were sound, but was being managed into the ground by a completely hapless and completely feckless team of senior managers. So really what you need to do is come in and replace the management. Which is what they see themselves as. And look, there is a contradiction here, because they are very often capable of saying like that. The problems are so profound and so far-reaching that it requires major, intensive change. At the same time, they seem to suggest that that's something that will be occasioned merely by their arrival. And one of the ways that this happens is their reluctance to face just the consequences of failure to spend over the course of the past decade and a half. The clear problems here are things like the hospital estates bill, for instance. There's about £12 billion worth of repairs needed to hospitals. Where that money is going to come from, who knows? West Streeting isn't going to give it to them. So it's certainly not the private sector. PFI, that would be brilliant. It's always worked out well in the past. Look, there are problems with the way the Labour Party thinks about the state and thinks about its relationship to it, thinks about the country that it's going to govern. I'm sort of skeptical about the tendency on the left to say that that the social democratic parties are just engaged in a different kind of project of management and disciplining of the working class than say the Conservative Party. I don't think that's true. I think there's a much more tense and difficult and complex relationship going on there. And I think back, there's a wonderful preface to Bagehot's very famous book on the English Constitution by Richard Crossman, who was a Labour politician in the 60s. And he makes the point that the Labour Party is formed out of a kind of democratic attempt to balance the concentrations of wealth and power which have otherwise governed the country. And that has altered the political system, and that is, fundamental to the Labour Party. At the same time, that is a very fundamentally vitiated internal democracy, right? In which actually the means of constraint on its executive and the means of constraint on the people at the top is very, are nugatory, really, and they just have decreased over time. What I mean here is that there is a question about the extent to which a Labour government is engaged in a project of democratization. I don't think the people at the top of the party are interested in it. I do think the party is beholden to different kinds of interests than the Conservative Party. And what that means is the kind of things that various organs of the British state are interested in change when the Labour Party comes into government. And that's quite unpredictable. It can often turn out pretty badly. It can often turn out interestingly. But what it does mean, and incidentally, this is a problem for the Conservative Party, in that it has forgotten how irrelevant it can feel to be in opposition, which many of us on the left know. A last thing on that is that I am slightly concerned about a gradual de-democratization of politics in the West in general, in Britain and America in particular, in which kind of the involvement of people in democracy of any kind, whether that's internal party democracy, whether it's kind of contestation either on the street or in terms of campaigning, is seen as this kind of extremely unpredictable and dangerous and a force which is always already degenerating into a mob, or is simply unmanageable, simply dangerous, or simply inadequate, and that what one has to do instead is line up behind your preferred reactionary billionaire or your preferred powerful person of one kind or another. And so you as a citizen are no longer a participant, you're merely lending your support in one way or another to this powerful person or that powerful person. This is part of the Trump phenomenon. It was part of the Johnson phenomenon. It was part of whatever. And look, this tension has always existed within representative democracy. Of course, you're choosing a representative in one way or another, and so that representative is always going to bear some ideological weight for you. But increasingly, that sense of oneself as an active citizen seems to be ever less present within our democracies, and it concerns me. It really concerns me.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to arrive at, because there does seem to be this commonality in the structure of intuitive suspicion of both participation and, I guess, thought more generally, that the sort of fascist tendencies of the Conservative Party, which, as we know, are in full throttle in many ways right now, ideologically speaking, and also the kind of contemptuous bureaucratic impulses that can be seen as endemic to Keir Starmer's Labour Party. In that sense, I think it's important to ask ourselves how they view the relationship between government and society, right? We had David Cameron's Big Society. We had Margaret Thatcher's There Are Only Individuals and Their Families. We had the sort of messianic Blairism who saw the Labour Party as the vehicle through which Britain as a whole unites itself. What do you think is Starmer's version of that, if there is one?
I'm not sure there is one. I think the closest it comes to it is in a sort of reanimated Wilsonism. The other thing that I don't know what to make of is the emphasis in the way that Starmer has talked about government on service, which is that it can come across as very pious, or very blue Labour-y, actually, in some ways. It's that very kind of Maurice Glasman sort of style thing about sort of public service. Look, I don't know is the answer. I don't know what his vision of the world is. The closest I think I come to it is that sort of Wilsonism. But I do think most of the things that you've cited there are attempts to come to terms with the long influence of Thatcherism. And this is such a kind of cliche left-wing thing to say, is like, Thatcher happened and everything's been shit since. Obviously that's true.
Correct.
Or it's all neoliberalism. These things are true, but they're not necessarily helpful on the level of kind of actual political action. But these have been kind of increasingly desperate attempts to manage the contradiction here, or manage the way in which, effectively the private sector hollows out the institutions, the state, the public services. It was possible. There were good temporary fixes to this stuff, which are now no longer available, right? So the the boom which characterized the early Blair years allowed a level of redistribution that simply isn't on the cards anymore. And I should point out that the Labour Party manifesto does not really talk about redistribution at all, and that's very, very striking. It's shocking the degree to which there's little being done there. It has been suggested that there are there are secret consultations going on about capital gains tax or inheritance tax. Those would be very good. They're still kind of not sufficient. I suppose what I would say is that, look, the question of what Keir Starmer thinks about the world is going to be important, because it's certainly possible that by the end of this year, depending on how the elections go in November, is that he might be, and certainly how the French elections go, he might be one of the most left-wing leaders on the world stage, and if not the most left-wing leader in the G7. Lots of that depends on what you think about China, to be honest. But he could be walking into a global situation that is very, very different to the one even that obtained when he started out in politics, let alone the one that characterized most of his adult life. That's a global situation in which wars are, increasingly frequent, in which the world is to some extent deglobalizing or sort of fragmenting and siloizing, in which the United States is engaged on a sort of strange internal democratic collapse, depending on what happens in November. But even if Biden is re-elected, I think there are some serious problems there. It's plausible under a Trump presidency that Britain becomes something like, DC in exile in terms of its, the last torchbearer for Atlanticism of some kind. Then we have the kind of more familiar domestic problems. We haven't talked about Brexit in this podcast. Nobody's talked about Brexit, except the Liberal Democrats a bit, in this election. It nonetheless remains a significant problem for British capital as much as anything else. Finance capital, the question is a little more complicated. And so it might well be that in a year's time, we find ourselves living under by our standards, a fairly right-wing social democrat, but who nonetheless looks like one of the most progressive leaders, certainly in the global north, as we enter into really crunch time for climate politics. Mm-hmm. Again, one of the things we haven't talked about here is the sort of the total, diminution of Labour's climate policies. I had an argument with someone the other day who was saying, well, why aren't you, can't you see that there are climate commitments here, they're serious, they're real, whatever. I said, look, yes, there are climate commitments in there, but what I see is the shell of the old climate commitment, and I don't even mean the Corbyn era climate commitment, I mean the one that Rachel Reeves came out with, 2 years ago. So on that sense, all of that is to say, I think there are interesting questions now for the left going into a Starmer administration, both in terms of its engagement outside the party, so questions for sort of protest movements, whether those are, say, anti-rearmament movements, anti-nuke movements. These are two questions which are going to be, very sadly, much higher on the agenda than they have been for either your or mine, our adult lives. Those are very, very serious questions which are likely to be on the agenda. Climate, of course, is going to be hugely important. And I think one of the things that we're likely to see is a whole swathe of green businessmen of one kind or another. Dale Vince, of course, being the guy who's out there campaigning, the founder of Ecotricity, out there campaigning for the Labour Party at the moment. They will be, probably made lords and various things like that, in order to kind of give some ballast. So there's going to be a big conflict, I think, domestically over the question of climate, the question of transition, the question of net zero, and all the ways that plays out. That's a big question for movements like Just Stop Oil, for Extinction Rebellion, things like that. We don't need to get into the question of their strategy here, but certainly they should be thinking about, because it changes, right? I mean, the Labour Party is no more a fan of Extinction Rebellion or whatever than the Conservative Party, but is more susceptible to the kind of pressures that they create than perhaps the Conservative Party is. The other thing here, is just the relationship let's say the part of the British left, which is much more substantial than it used to be, that is not completely sceptical about political representation and political party representation, has been in a sort of graveyard slumber for the past few years, partly because it's been, licking its wounds from 2019. It has done that for rather too long. I include myself here. It's done that for rather too long, and it has found itself in a position where it's been completely trounced by its opponents, certainly within the Labour Party, and hasn't found an alternative means of reformation, of forward movement. And look, there's lots of stuff under this coming government that should be important to the left. Will there be any reversal of or will there be greater austerity? Are we going to get a sort of Chumbawamba moment early on where, there's a sellout of a Dockers strike or whatever? It won't be Dockers this time around, but it would probably be public sector or something like that. I'm referring, of course, to them dumping a bucket of ice over John Prescott at an award ceremony. Excellent moment early on in the Blair era. So yeah, I think this stuff is really going to be key. And at the moment, I'm afraid to say I don't see. One of the striking factors about this election is that the left has been mostly absent from it.
So I am, unsurprisingly, one of the last people to defend the Tory party, right? I think as we've been nodding at throughout this chat, there are structural forces that account for the complete clown car disaster show that we're seeing now in the party of governance, that are built into the British state, built into the collapse of the social state, built into the structure of world politics, that, of course, the Conservatives have completely failed to adequately deal with, right? But they don't begin and end within the remit of this one party. I would love us to spend a bit more time kind of elaborating that. You've of course mentioned climate change, which is one of the big ones. I'd also like to spend some time a little bit on Brexit, which of course it's become this sort of almost identitarian issue. I hesitate to use that term because it is, annoying and baggy. But what we're talking about here is the reformulation of the structure of British capital and its relationship to the rest of the world in many ways. And of course, you have things like the mass inheritance of, social abandonment that, Keir Starmer et al. Will have to decide whether or not to deal with, I guess.
Yeah, events, dear boy, events. There are. Look, there are massive and serious sort of structural problems which impact the British state. The inflationary shock and the question of sort of energy pricing and energy interruptions to energy supply have characterized have been underlying lots of the problems of the past couple of years. In one sense, I'm always hesitant to ascribe to structural factors changes or purely to structural factors changes in British politics, because of course the question of politics is how you deal with those structural factors, and the truth is, as you're suggesting, the Conservative Party simply isn't able to deal with them, hasn't been able to deal with them very well, and that's partly because they're largely in hock to the kind of people who make huge profits out of this sort of stuff.
Right.
The energy stuff is going to continue to be important. The next decade or so, it seems to me, is going to be characterized by less certainty in the supply of old hydrocarbon energy, and which will, is already impelling a kind of more rapid transition. And that's one of the things that this kind of state-led investment vehicle is supposed to help with. The question of food is going to become ever more important. And I really, I do think it's in some sense underpriced as part of the crisis of a during the Starmer period. Will be just interruptions in the supply chain for food. Increasingly, look at the good example here is something like everyone can see that olive oil is more expensive, right? I don't think anyone's bought olive oil recently and not gone, how much? And one of the reasons for that is the impact of climate change on olive growing regions in the Mediterranean.
Right.
This is really, really, it's a clear knock-on effect of climate change. And, this is going to start to happen. I mean, it's obviously already happening, but start to happen on a far wider scale with goods that we take for granted. That is going to be part and parcel of a Starmer administration. They should have that on their horizon. I do think, the question of Brexit, if you're the kind of person who looks at the world, say, as a succession of, less nation states than kind of, large empires rising and falling and sort of often manifesting through sort of links of nation states, it just seems kind of strange for Britain to think that it can, to be prey of its former imperial delusion and cut itself off from the sort of the next empire that it's part of. But it feels like there's not going to be a clear resolution to that anytime soon. There will probably be, in the way that often happens in the British state, a series of accommodations that save face while fundamentally changing the relationship underneath. So, there are questions here about what Europe wants from Britain and whatever, and I don't think those are necessarily easily predictable now. Partly because, of course, the political complexion of Europe is changing and not for the better. And I don't think Britain is immune to that, despite having sort of cut its formal links to Europe. I don't see the political phenomena that are going on in, say, Italy or Germany or France as that distinct from what's happening here in Britain. And in a sense that's telling, and that should allow us to predict some things, right? So you look at something like Italy and you think, okay, well, the way that the sort of post-fascist right has been successful in Italy is not via a character like Nigel Farage, but has been a sort of youngish woman who looks kind of human and plausible while coming out with the most sort of horrifying stuff, who is sort of internationally fairly conciliatory. So, Giorgia Meloni has nice things to say about the idea of Europe, largely because it's it's a site of kind of fascist cultural renaissance for her, right? Like the European ideal.
Right, the sort of the pan-European new far right and the reimagining of whiteness is...
But what that tells us is that probably the political threat to watch out for over the course of the next 10 years is someone who's not really on the radar yet. It's not going to be Nigel Farage. There's just a ceiling to Nigel Farage's support, right? It's people who love him really love him, and they have an outsized weight in politics. But the danger is his successor, is someone who can, who really looks plausible. I do think it will be a woman. It does seem to work that way, and I don't know why. And there's all sorts of interesting gender stuff going on there. But yeah, no, I think, and again, this question about about the structural factors. So yes, sort of ideological regroupment on the extreme right. Hugely important. A sort of gradual abandonment of, I don't want to talk about norms. It makes you sound like a sort of dreadful, wet American. But things like taking for granted the sort of the restraining measures that were put in place in the post-war period as part of a sort of doubtlessly compromised, but grieved and horrified realization of what had just happened in Europe. So I'm talking about sort of human rights instruments, international cooperation agreements, things like that. The emotional force which kept those as part of people's sort of central sense of the structures that we needed, it just is disappearing. War, climate, these kind of things, they're hugely important. And the other sort of key thing, it seems to me, is just the disarray in which the British left still finds itself. And that seems to me to be something we really desperately need to address. And I'm very, very concerned.
What I'm curious about is what will be left in the wake of a kind of Starmerite first term, right? Because there does seem to be this almost nostalgic attachment to strategies of governance that just don't attend to the kind of depths of crises that you've been outlining, right? From the sort of Atlanticism of the Blair years, or this kind of fiscal monetary conservatism, which hamstrings you into being able to do precisely fuck all about anything ever. But of course, you have the fact of, okay, if you don't deal with the depths of the crisis, even parking climate change, parking war, these big existential threats, right? The fact that people aren't able to feed themselves if everything were to just hold firm, we know that doesn't redound to particularly fantastic politics if left unchecked. So, where should we be looking to sort of see what might come next if Starmer, fails to do anything about the state of Britain as it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where, the joke in the last French election was, was Macron and then Le Pen, right? I mean, the one gives rise to the other. I think that's often a rather glib way of thinking about these things. I don't think politics is ever so predictable, and I think the last decade of British politics will tell you that much. However, there are a series of crises that the British state is going through, right? And those are crises on the ideological level, about the kind of ideas that are expressed in media, in politics, in Parliament, in the ways in which the things that we take to be important, the ways in which we respond to the world. There are crises in the structure of governance, so that one of the things we haven't really talked about is that it's just very difficult to get the British state to do things, partly because it's been hollowed out by outsourcing, partly because its expertise has been shattered over decades and decades of defunding. So it's very, very difficult to get the British state to do things. And even if Starmer were coming into office with a hugely generous sort of desire to replenish and rebuild and whatever, it would still be very difficult to get that done. There is also a crisis, just in terms of kind of time frames, right? Like everything needs doing now. Yeah. And so it's kind of that is screaming for a resolution, and in a sense, there is an unparalleled, I cannot believe I'm saying this, there is an unparalleled opportunity for Keir Starmer coming into government to do something about it. He's going to have an absolutely massive majority and will have a very wide hand. Even the capital markets will say, we will lend to you, please come and do so, because they want a functioning state as much as anything else. I'm skeptical about how that will manifest, and that's really dangerous, because that is the moment where a resurgent far right says, well, we have plans for national renaissance as well, and you haven't delivered. And lots of things, that there are lots of contingencies and unpredictabilities here. What the Conservative Party does in opposition, whether it sort of falls into sort of the lamprey grin of Nigel Farage, whether it turns the other way. So there are lots of things that aren't clear here, but it's worth being worried about them. I think the other thing we have to say is that the left has found it difficult to reconstitute itself. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I'm very concerned about is, look, I don't have any objection about, I think it's good that people are campaigning for Corbyn in this election. I think it would be good if the Labour Party got egg on its face for the way that it behaved over the selection of someone like Faisal Shaheen. I think it would be very good if the Labour candidate were defeated in Islington North. I think it would be very good if the Greens took some seats off the Labour Party, because it needs to understand that it can't take that proportion of, I don't mean just the organised left, but that proportion of the electorate who is sympathetic to the left, that it can't take them for granted. But really beyond that, beyond the kind of defence of these sort of the sentimental defence of these totemic figures, many of whom are getting very, very old now, I think the British left as a general, in the most general sense, doesn't have a clear sense of what happens next, doesn't have a clear sense of how to exert power of any kind under a Starmer government. It doesn't have a clear sense of of how it's, other than, these very vague nostrums about, oh, well, let's join let's build power in the community. It's like, okay, well, fine, but concrete, please.
Where?
Where,
how,
etc. Which is all very easy for me to say, of course.
Sure, but there is a question about, okay, we've mentioned that the Labour Party might have sort of endemic social forces that it might be more responsive to than a sort of equivalent Conservative Party. There's also perhaps the idea that the modern Labour Party, at least, is trying desperately to rearrange those social forces such that it no longer has to be so beholden to them. So I'm wondering how the left responds in the context of that kind of basically open hostility, and also a loss of a basis of institutions and social infrastructure that sort of make change possible.
Yeah, I mean, the quick answer to that is I don't know.
Right.
And if I knew, I wouldn't be sitting here. I would probably still be sitting here. But
thank you.
It's far easier to identify problems than solutions here, and I recognise that fully. But there does seem to be, I suppose the thing I would say is that there is a dangerous nostalgia which can transform into a sort of voluntarism, right? Like it was better when we all saw each other a lot and were all in strong trade union branches, and we were all, we had those kind of thick, con-social institutions from which power was built. I think I agree that that's true. I think that the destruction of that has been, part and parcel of the past 40 years. I do think probably you have to think about where people go to find their politics now. And it's usually not in those kind of, consociational bodies where they even exist anymore. And so you live in a much more atomized society than you did even, I think, even more than 20 years ago. The other problem here is the Labour Party. Lots of people, I'm sure myself included, have, various sort of wounded attachments to bits of the Labour Party, and have very strange psychic investments in what it does and what it's for.
Sure, I don't know what you mean.
But it's also, look, the Labour Party, its structure reflects the British Constitution. The British Constitution empowers the centre and empowers the executive in a vast way with very few checks and balances. And the Constitution, this is a point Raymond Williams made in the 60s, the Labour Party's Constitution actually more or less reflects exactly the same kind of extensive power for its executive that the Crown in Parliament has. And that means that, Nye Bevan, for instance, called these institutions the greatest of social shock absorbers. And that's a thing that is a problem. It does feel like people pour endless amounts of energy into the Labour Party for very little reward. But I would be the first to say that there are very few other options as well. And so it seems to me that the central question, as part of, if you accept that there is a widespread crisis here that affects every level of British society, part of the question is how politics is expressed, how it finds institutional form, how it exerts power. And I'm really, really conscious that I'm talking in abstract terms about questions rather than answers. And so I suppose what I would say is things that I know not to be solutions. One, a kind of tiny role-playing sects, right? That seem to be constituted of everyone sort of role-playing Lenin. It just, that doesn't grasp the scale, right? It doesn't grasp the scale on which politics needs to be conducted, right?
You can't all be Lenin.
Yeah. Exodus doesn't work either, right? There is no outside of politics for you to go to sort of start a new world in the ashes of the world. I wish there were. I've been very attracted to this as in the past, like the kind of total refusal of political power in one way or another. And beyond that, signs of counterpower do not look very strong. What the trade unions do is very important, but they seem to move quite slowly. And they seem, I think trade unions have improved massively over the course of the past decade. But still their willingness to engage in kind of political strategy, partly because the structure of trade union legislation in this country is very, very small. The social movements don't seem to cohere into look at the series. Even over the course of the past year, you have these kind of flashes of kind of wide penetration, but very thinly organized structures that just sort of then disappear, are reduced to email lists. The conflagrations or organizations around the cost of living crisis are the most obvious example of this. So that question of how one forms institutions and how one grapples with the question of power seems to me to be very important. So the sad and bleak answer is I don't know. But I think we ought to be trying to find out.
There's an equivalent question that, of course, the Conservative Party will be asking itself, right? And I think it's important for us to ask of the Conservative Party, right? Which is, what happens now, right? Whither the Tories? Because I guess there are two questions nested within that, right? Is one, what does the shape of the future Tory party look like, and does it get kind of pulled apart by its various warring factions or reconstituted by them? And the other bit is what happens to sort of individual Tories who, personally have had this enormous impact on the shape of the country as we know it today, and who are noping out of the party itself, right? They, the rats are fleeing the sinking ship. They're going somewhere, right? So, those are the kind of two questions that I would love you to, that I would love to get you to weigh in on.
Great and important questions. Yes, the key example of the second one is someone like Michael Gove, who is, by political standards, quite young, and is presumably has recognised that his life as an institutional power player in institutional politics is over. But he's young by political standards. He likes or thinks it's important for him to be involved in politics. So one can see it's quite likely that he'll return to the pages of the Times. And what he clearly feels is that he can influence the direction of both conservatism and the British state by returning to the media. So I think you'll see lots of these people trying to find ways to influence this stuff through the press in one way or another. What the Conservative Party more broadly does is a really interesting question. So the way they, there are occasionally people saying, oh, let's return to Cameronism of some kind, right? So where we detoxify the party and look sort of less evil for a bit. And
sure.
I don't think that's plausible with the kind of people who will be left in Parliament after this election. We don't think Priti Patel is going to preside over a return to Cameronism. I don't think Suella Braverman is going to. The question of whether, I for years was expecting, Nick Timothy, May's kind of reactionary chief of staff, policy ideologue, for a long time, it looked certain that he'd be returned to Parliament in this election. By returned, I don't mean that he's been there before. It's just the technical term that people use when people, anyway, whatever. That he would become an MP in this election. His seat looked reasonably like a safe Tory seat. It now looks, maybe less so. He's the kind of person who could lead a sort of a reactionary, but sort of Christian democratic reform, and I mean that in the sense of pursuing the kind of policies that the Christian Democrats pursued, that probably where Theresa May's actual kind of instincts were in Germany and to a lesser extent in Italy, which is sort of strong nation, vaguely concerned about the poor, but primarily quite reactionary. That always looked possible, and his Telegraph columns are really kind of triumph of reaction in some ways. Anyway, who knows? But that's the tension for the Conservatives. It does seem to me that there's something that will be very destructive for them but then really the Conservatives under the first term of Blair were a mess for and beyond. So they will be casting around for a long time, I think. If the party survives at all. It really could just completely collapse. So one of the problems in this election, and I think we will see many converts to electoral reform on the right, which would be a sort of strange place for them, because there is a problem if 35% of your population vote for a centre-right or right-wing party and they have almost no representation in politics. And I mean that not just in an abstract sense that it's fairer. I also mean that they're going to feel some resentment, and that resentment is an important political emotion, and it can be plied and, preyed upon and channeled in ways that are very, very dangerous and very, very socially destructive. So that's a concern. I can't see the Labour Party doing much about electoral reform, given how timid they've been, even on the House of Lords. But, the question of electoral fairness will be on the lips of some very strange people after this election.
We've been talking from the basis of a certain kind of certainty, right? That Keir Starmer is probably going to be the next prime minister, that he's going to form the next government, et cetera, et cetera. We've also seen shocks at the polls in recent memory, right? Positive and negative shocks. If there are surprises at the next election, where do you see those coming from? Like, what haven't we been taking full account of when we're thinking about this, the electoral forces at stake?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think there are. So one of the things that's been very striking over the course of the last week or so is there have been lots of these kind of MRP polls, the multi-level regression and post-stratification, that method that uses kind of large samples to predict, across quite wide, every seat, using sort of demographic statistics. There's quite a range of outcomes there, which is partly the result of lots of kind of Conservative seats being basically on a knife edge. And lots depends on whether you expect people to vote tactically or not. My sense about tactical voting, incidentally, is that it's best to kind of be kind of quite circumspect about telling people to vote tactically, or we've designed a machine to tell you to, for instance, vote for the reactionary ex-Tory in Kensington over Emma Dent Code in the last election. Completely outrageous. Nonetheless, people do vote tactically and will vote tactically, I think, in this election, partly because this election is motivated by deep, deep animus for the Conservative Party. Surprises, I think, relatively few on the horizon. I think we may be surprised by the Greens. It feels, and partly that's because there's been some interesting polling in some of the Green target seats, which suggests that they're doing really quite well. Again, I'm kind of skeptical about whether that translates at the ballot box or not. I think there's a strong centripetal effect to the main parties. The small parties or the independent candidates, so the question of Galloway is an interesting one. I don't mean interesting in a positive way, but I think that would be an interesting one to watch. The other one, of course, is Farage and Clacton, which I do think it's quite probable. Actually, it feels quite probable and it seems quite probable that he will win, and that's really difficult. I mean, once he has a position in Parliament, people seem to be convinced that he'll undo himself by having a seat in Parliament. I don't think that's true at all. All of which is to say, there is a long legacy of people being very scared about trusting polls in this country because of 1992 and shy Tory voters, right?
Yeah.
So
that's called shame.
Yes, it was called shame, but it was also called just bad polling, right?
Right.
The mechanisms are a bit better now. I don't think they're perfect, but they're a bit better. The Labour leader is very, very consistent. The way that things have been moving and the fact that the enthusiasm for Labour is not necessarily enormous and world-shattering, but what you're seeing is the exigencies of a first past the post system for a divided party on the right, and that is what's really screwing them. So I'm quite. I don't think there will be many surprises on election night. One thing that will be interesting and funny, I think, is the question of the total percentage that vote for the Labour Party, because I feel like it's probably not going to be more than it was in 2017, which will at least make me smile.
I think that's probably where we should leave it, with you smiling, hopefully at the downfall.
Rare example. Yes, Schadenfreude.
There we go.
Schadenfreude will be my characteristic emotion on the evening of July the 4th.
Yes, there is an image that's been circulating both on social media and in my private imagination for the last 5 years, which is I don't want a Labour government, I want revenge. So that's probably all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been very enlightening.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support.